Hello, this is another one of my videos on Alistair Parker's book, The Second World War. This one, the last in the series on strategic bombing, in which I'll briefly discuss the bombing of Japan. It comes from this very long chapter on strategic bombing. Strategic bombing in World War II reached its climax in the American campaign against Japan in 1945. Initially, American strategists had hoped to bomb Japan from bases in China, but these were too far away, even for the very long-range B-29 bombers, the super fortresses, which came into service in June 1944 with a range of 3,500 miles. That's 5,633 kilometers, and able to carry 4 tons of bombs. But these could only reach Japan's southernmost main island of Kyushu. This is the situation in the Pacific War on the 1st of August 1945. You'll see that at that time Japan still controlled a very large area. So you've got the Japanese home islands, southern Sakhalin, Korea, large parts of China, Taiwan, Indochina, and Malaya, and Siam, Thailand as an ally at that time, and then Dutch East Indies. Russia at this point was still neutral, and the areas under Allied control were the western part of China and the Pacific areas reconquered by the Americans and Australians. So demands for closer bases for the American Air Force were met when Admiral Nimitz directed his forces to the Mariana Islands, where they secured the islands of Saipan, Tinian, and Guam. This enabled B-29s to reach Tokyo, with the first attack on the city by the B-29s on the 24th of November 1944. This is the first after the carrier-based attack in April 1942. Japan then still had enough experienced fighter pilots to inflict heavy losses, however, until the Americans were able to seize the island of Iwo Jima in March 1945, 650 miles, just over 1,000 kilometers from the mainland, enabling the American bombers to be protected by the shorter range Mustang fighters and for use as an emergency landing ground for their bombers. The American Air Force quickly reenacted the experiences of RAF Bomber Command over Germany, initially aiming for daylight, high-altitude precision attacks, mainly against aircraft factories. But bad weather and high winds often make precision bombing impossible, and most bombs were radar-guided and highly inaccurate, so that over 80% of the bombs dropped landed more than 3,000 feet, almost a kilometer, from their targets. By March 1945, despite their earlier disdain for the unpleasant British practice, the American Air Force had switched to area bombing with low-level nighttime raids using a high proportion of incendiary bombs, which were devastating against Japanese towns, in which densely packed houses were often constructed of wood and bamboo. Although publicly justified as a means of reducing the productivity of Japanese industrial workers, area bombing was also employed as a means to destroy morale by terror. On March the 9th, 1945, 334 B-29s raided Tokyo, and strong winds set off a firestorm, which was visible 150 miles away. 16 square miles of the city were burnt out, and 1/4 of the city's buildings, 267,000, were destroyed. 1 million people lost their homes, and about 80,000 people were killed. The American Air Force had caught up with, or perhaps surpassed, the RAF in their slaughter months before Hiroshima. General MacDonald, the American Air Force's Director of Intelligence, condemned the raid as a policy of homicide and destruction. This is a picture of Tokyo after the firebombing on the night of the 9th to 10th March 45. Another photograph of Tokyo during a firebomb assault in May 1945. And this is an aerial view of Tokyo following the war, showing the extent of the devastation. American public opinion was far less opposed to area bombing of Japanese cities compared to those of Germany, partly because of hostility over Pearl Harbor and Japanese ill treatment of American POWs, but also because of an acceptance of racist stereotypes. Henry L. Stimson, the American Secretary of War, claimed that the bombing was necessary because the Japanese had dispersed their war production among individual workers' homes. In the next 4 weeks after the Tokyo raid, 5 more Japanese cities lost 37 square miles of buildings. There was then a pause, caused by the stock of incendiary bombs having run low, but there were further raids from late June onwards through to the end of the war on the 14th of August, attacking another 55 cities, and on average destroying about half the built-up area of each. From late July, leaflets were dropped warning citizens of the target cities that they were due to be bombed, in addition to some other cities that weren't. By that time, there was almost no effective Japanese resistance to American aircraft, and few were hit. For example, 1 aircraft from 8,000 sorties over smaller cities. All told, about 22 million people had been made homeless, 1/3 of Japan's urban population. This is one of the leaflets dropped by the Americans. It shows the names of Japanese cities targeted for destruction by firebombing. The other side includes the words, "We cannot promise that only these cities will be among those attacked." Meanwhile, the 509th Bombardment Group were practicing precision bombing by individual planes, which broke away sharply after bomb release over cities, which had hitherto suffered little or no bombing. 2 of these, each dropping a single bomb, brought strategic bombing to its climax. The first, an atomic bomb, which exploded over the center of Hiroshima at 8:15 in the morning on the 6th of August, and the second at 11:30 in the morning on the 9th of August over Nagasaki. Estimates for the number of people killed range from 80,000 to 150,000 at Hiroshima and 20,000 to 80,000 at Nagasaki, together with about 30,000 seriously injured in each city, mostly from severe burns. The atomic age had arrived. The pictures show the mushroom clouds above Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This is the route taken by the aircraft that bombed those 2 cities. They're taking off from the Mariana Islands, flying over to Japan and back. The impact of the American bombing was considerable. The B-29s weakened civilian morale, destroying confidence in the army, which was held responsible for its failure to defend the people of Japan. The military command suffered in 1945 because of its past reluctance to tell the truth about the progress of the war. Suddenly disillusioned, the civilians lost their respect for the army. The Japanese government had not made sufficient preparation to deal with the effects of bombing. Air raids had not been expected, as it was assumed that the enemy's air force would be too far away to strike, and therefore no precautions had been made. When bombing occurred, the response was completely inadequate, both in terms of rapid care for the wounded and the provision of food and shelter for the homeless. Under these circumstances, the victims' anger turned against the government and not the enemy. The Japanese people didn't wish for an American victory, as according to American investigators, they believed the government's propaganda that defeat would be followed by brutalities, starvation, enslavement, or annihilation. Nor did they clamor for an end to the war. Not only had there been no outlet or possible organization to enable the people to make such a demand, but low morale in war typically shows itself in exclusive concern for individual self-preservation rather than public issues. Notably, members of the government shared the popular despair and began to try to curb the disastrous heroics of the army leaders. So that ends this chapter on strategic bombing. Many thanks to you for listening, and particular thanks to my patrons for their kind support and encouragement, without which I wouldn't be able to make these videos. You're very welcome to support my channel if you wish to. Please do like, comment and share on the videos themselves. Subscribe if you want to be notified of future videos. Patreon and PayPal links below if you want to provide practical support. And next week we'll move on to a new chapter on morale. Have a good day.